I'm sure, just like me, you're feeling a bit helpless and overwhelmed when it comes to dealing with the bushfire crisis. And we need to remember that this is a marathon, not a sprint. So I've enlisted the help of my good friend and psychologist Sandy Ray to help us navigate how to look after our own mental health and that of others during this recovery period. Now, this is a bit of a tricky topic, survivor guilt. Sandy, what is it?
Survivor guilt really is a very true phenomenon, similar to PTSD, where people react to a life-threatening situation which they may otherwise not have been involved in. Some research from a clinic in the UK said that 90% of people who had witnessed a trauma felt guilty that they survived that trauma or weren't impacted in the same degree as the first initial people response or involvement in the trauma.
And so who can be affected by this?
I guess really anyone can be affected where there's a trauma involved. That could be cancer, it could be car crash, it could be violence, it can be the bushfires, those sorts of trauma. How come, 3 houses around me got burnt down, but there by the grace of God, a wind came along and swept the fire and my house survived, or my children or my livestock survived. So why was I lucky enough to have that and my neighbours experience devastation and loss?
And why do they feel guilt?
I guess they feel guilty because they're questioning in their mind, could I have done something to prevent this particular disaster? Could I have predicted this disaster and I did nothing? What was my role in this disaster unfolding? So they're the sorts of things that survivors often play over and over and over in their head. How come other people have experienced such loss, but I was lucky enough to avoid that loss?
And why doesn't it affect everyone?
There's a number of reasons why it doesn't affect everyone. First time people might say, it's happened, I'm done with it. Other people, it happens because they have risk factors. So we have risk factors and protective factors in psychological health, in mental health. And the risk factors for survivor guilt will be a history of mental health or psychiatric issues, some sort of previous abuse, different coping strategies. So their coping strategies and responses to trauma are not well practiced. Often it's a lack of social support, and what that means is a lack of an ability to talk about it or have people around you to support you in understanding what's happened in this trauma.
And as a psychologist, what sort of treatment do you recommend?
I guess one of the first things is it's called mindfulness. So that means sitting in the moment, here and now. So one of the first things we do when someone is experiencing trauma is we engage in what's called a grounding technique. So getting people back to, where are you right now? Where am I? I feel the side of my chair. I can feel myself breathing. I can hear my heartbeat. So calming things down and getting a sense of perspective of what were the dynamics surrounding the trauma, and why was it that you were lucky enough to avoid that trauma and not be directly involved in it, in terms of you survived and somebody else maybe lost their life. So it's really about CBT and mindfulness, about understanding the situation.
So is there any good news?
The good news is that over time, that sense of survivor guilt will diminish. And there's a number of ways you can do that. First of all, and primarily, is self-care. Exercise, sleep, eating well. The other way is actually engaging in other focus. So instead of focusing on yourself, engage in activities that share yourself around. So it might be helping out a charity. It might be doing some volunteer work. It might be, if you're involved in the fires, for instance, you needing to step into your community and seeing what you can do to help others. So what we call other focus rather than self-focus. So the good news is that hopefully, over time, these feelings of guilt will diminish.
Thanks for your time, Sandy.